heard them through the kitchen wall, and I didn't move, not even to set down the dish I was holding. My son-in-law was talking first. His voice carries the way it always does, like he's never once considered that other people might be in the room. He said, "She signed the deed. What else is there to discuss?" My daughter said something lower, something I couldn't make out, and then he said, "She's not going anywhere. That's the whole problem." I put the dish down very carefully on the counter. The window over the sink was fogged from the pot I had going on the stove. I had made pot roast. I had made it because my daughter mentioned once, maybe 2 years ago, that she used to love it when I made pot roast on Sundays. I had driven to the grocery store that morning in the rain to get the right cut of meat. I stood there and I listened. "She walks around like it's still her house," he said. "It was her house," my daughter said. "Was." He let that sit. "The title transferred in September. She knows that. I just think we need to have a real conversation about what this arrangement looks like going forward, because this isn't sustainable." I didn't know what sustainable meant to him. I thought it probably meant me. "My name is Irene. I am 68 years old. I was a school librarian for 31 years in the same building where my daughter went to kindergarten, where she checked out her first chapter book, where she cried once in the biography section because a boy had been mean to her on the bus, and I had held her there between the shelves and told her that people who are unkind are almost always carrying something heavy. I believed that when I said it. I still try to. I moved in with my daughter and her husband 14 months ago. After my husband passed, that was 3 years ago now, a Tuesday in March, one of those flat gray days that doesn't seem capable of holding something that large, I stayed in the house we shared for 26 years. I stayed there one winter and then another. My sister called every Sunday. My neighbor Patty brought over soup sometimes. I was fine. I told everyone I was fine, and most of the time I meant it. But then my daughter called me one evening in April and she said, "Mom, we want you closer. We have the space. We've been talking about it and we really want you to come." She sounded like she meant it. That's the thing I keep turning over. She sounded exactly like she meant it. The house I'd lived in for 26 years wasn't paid off. There was still a mortgage on it, smaller than it had been, but there. My husband had handled most of the finances, and when he was gone, I learned things about our situation that I hadn't fully understood before. Not bad things, just things. The kind of details that live in file folders and don't announce themselves until someone is gone and you're sitting at the kitchen table at 11 at night trying to understand what a variable rate means. My daughter and her husband suggested I sell the house, pay off what was left, and put the equity toward something that would help us all. They had found a lot 2 streets over from where they lived. A corner lot, nice trees, room for a small addition someday, and they had a plan. If I contributed the equity for my house, they could build an in-law suite attached to their home. I would have my own entrance, my own small kitchen. I would be independent, but close. It sounded reasonable, more than reasonable. It sounded like something a family does when they love each other. I sold the house in August. I put the equity in. The deed was in both their names, and a lawyer I didn't know very well explained the paperwork to me in about 20 minutes, in an office that smelled like carpet cleaner. I signed. I thought that was what you did when your family asked you to trust them. The in-law suite took longer than they said it would. There were permits, then a contractor who fell behind, then a change in the plan that my son-in-law said was necessary, but that made my space smaller than we'd originally discussed. I was living in their guest room the whole time, using their bathroom, eating dinner with them every night at the table where he sat at the head and talked about interest rates, and a man at his office named Dale who was, apparently, a constant source of frustration. The suite was finished in September, a few weeks before I heard them through the kitchen wall. I have a notebook I keep in the drawer of my nightstand. I have kept notebooks my whole life. Not diaries, exactly. More like the kind of record-keeping a librarian can't help doing. I write down things I want to remember. Passages from books. Things people say that stay with me. After my husband died, I started writing down numbers too. What I spent. What came in from his pension. What the heating bill was in January. It was a way of feeling like I had a hold on something. That night, after I heard the conversation, I didn't go back into the living room. I said I wasn't feeling well, which was true, in a way, and I went to my suite and I sat on my bed and I opened the notebook. I had written down everything from the house sale, the number from the closing, what we had agreed the in-law suite would cost and what it had actually cost, what I paid every month for groceries, for my share of the utilities, for my own phone. I had also written down what I knew about the property my equity had gone into, the assessed value, what comparable homes in the neighborhood had sold for recently. All of it gathered quietly over months because I am a librarian and looking things up is not a choice I make so much as something I breathe. I sat with the notebook for a long time. Then I called my sister. Her name is Wanda, and she is 72, and she lives in Tucson, and she has never liked my son-in-law. She didn't say I told you so. She just listened, and at the end she said, "What do you want to do, Irene?" I didn't know yet, but I was starting to. There is a woman at my church named Phyllis. She is 80 years old, and she taught high school English for 38 years, and she is the sharpest person I know. We walk together on Thursday mornings along the path by the reservoir, and we talk about books and about our children and about what it means to be a woman of a certain age in a world that would prefer you didn't take up too much space. I told Phyllis what I'd heard. I told her about the deed, about the equity, about the suite that was smaller than planned. I told her what my son-in-law had said about sustainable. She walked for a moment without saying anything. Then she said, "Do you have an attorney?" I had used a real estate attorney for the closing, but I hadn't consulted anyone independently before signing. I told her that. "Get one," she said. "Not theirs. Yours." I made an appointment the following week with a woman named Patricia, a property and estate attorney whose office was downtown near the old library branch where I'd worked my first 10 years. I paid for the consultation myself in cash from an account I had opened the previous month at a different bank than the one my daughter and I shared. I'd been quiet about that. I'd been quiet about a lot of things. Patricia had an unhurried way of listening that I recognized from the best teachers I'd known. She let me lay out the whole thing before she asked a single question. When I was done, she was quiet for a moment and then she said, "There are a few things I'd like to look at." We met 3 times over 6 weeks. She reviewed the deed transfer, the original agreement between me and my daughter and her husband, what had been put in writing versus what had been verbal, what protections I had retained and what I had not. There were things she found that I hadn't known about. Nothing criminal. I want to be clear about that, because my daughter is not a criminal. But there were things that had not been explained to me fully, and there were options I had not been told I had. Patricia explained them to me in plain language, the way I used to explain the Dewey Decimal System to third graders who thought it was complicated. "It's not complicated," I always told them. "It's just a system. You just have to learn how it works." There was a clause in the original construction agreement, one I'd signed, that referenced my right to a formal residency arrangement if the property were ever sold or transferred. It was vague, but it was there. Patricia said vague cuts both ways, and that depending on what I wanted, there were a few different paths. I told her what I wanted. She wrote it down. The Thursday before Thanksgiving, my daughter came into my suite without knocking. She does this sometimes, which I have not said anything about, because I choose my moments. She said, "Mom, I've been meaning to ask, are you okay? You've seemed a little distant lately." I said I was fine. I offered her tea. She sat at my small table and wrapped both hands around the mug and said, "I know the transition has been hard. I know it wasn't exactly what we planned with the size of the space. I feel bad about that." I watched her face. She looked like she meant it. Maybe she did. My daughter's not a bad person. I've thought about this a great deal over the past few months, and I keep arriving at the same place. She is not bad, but she is led. She follows the person in front of her, and the person in front of her is a man who sees most things in terms of what they're worth. I said, "I appreciate you saying that." She said, "I just want you to be happy here." I said, "I know." After she left, I sat for a while. The light was coming through the window the way it does on late November afternoons, low and golden and a little melancholy. I thought about the 26 years in my old house. I thought about the night my husband came home from his first cardiology appointment and sat at the kitchen table and couldn't look at me for a minute, and then said, "It's not nothing, Irene." I thought about the way my daughter had called when she was in college, sometimes just to hear my voice, not to say anything important. I thought, people are not only one thing, they are the whole ledger. But I also thought about what sustainable meant to my son-in-law, and I thought about what it meant to me. And those were not the same word. I went home to Wanda's for Thanksgiving. I told my daughter I needed to see my sister, that it had been too long. She said of course that was fine, though I noticed her look at her husband when I said it. He was very pleasant when he said goodbye. He told me to drive safe. I drove south on the 91 and I listened to a program on the radio about the history of a small town in New Mexico that had survived 150 years of flood and drought and hard luck. And the people they interviewed all talked about it the same way. Not like survivors, just like people who had stayed. There's a difference. Wanda had made tamales. We sat at her kitchen table until midnight, and at some point her cat got onto my lap and stayed there, which I took as a good sign. I told her about Patricia, about what I'd learned, about what I'd decided. Wanda listened with her chin in her hand, and at the end she said, "And how do you feel about it?" I thought about it honestly. I said, "Peaceful," which surprised me. She said, "It doesn't surprise me." I asked her why. She said, "Because you always feel better when you know what you're doing." I drove back on the Sunday after Thanksgiving. The suite looked the same as I'd left it, small but mine. I'd put up pictures I cared about. A watercolor my husband had bought at a street market in Santa Fe the year we drove out there for our anniversary. A framed print of the library at Trinity College in Dublin that I'd looked at in a magazine once and thought, if I could stand anywhere in the world, a photograph of my daughter when she was 7, sitting on a beach somewhere in a yellow swimsuit, squinting into the sun. I had put that up deliberately. I wanted to look at it every day and remember that she is also that child on the beach, that the person and the child are the same, that people are the whole ledger. December moved the way it does. Too fast, and then suddenly too slow. My son-in-law mentioned twice, in a way that seemed casual but wasn't, that they'd had interest from a developer about the lot next door, and that it had made him think about long-term plans for the whole property. I said that sounded interesting. I did not say anything else. On the 15th of December, I met with Patricia one more time. She had prepared 2 documents. I read them carefully. I asked 3 questions. I signed where she indicated. She made copies and handed me a folder, and she said, "You should keep these somewhere safe, separate from your home." I left the folder with Wanda. I mailed her the second copy. Christmas morning, I was up before anyone else. I made coffee in my small kitchen and sat by my window and watched the light come up. It was cold, clear, the kind of morning that feels expensive. No snow. We're in Southern California. There's never snow. But the air was clean, and the mountains to the north were visible in that sharp winter way they sometimes are when everything else is quiet. My daughter and son-in-law opened their door around 9. They came over to wish me a Merry Christmas, and I had gifts for them. A cashmere sweater for her that I'd chosen carefully. A bottle of bourbon for him that Wanda's neighbor had told me was excellent. We sat in their living room for a while and drank coffee, and my daughter told me about a trip they were thinking about taking in the spring. She seemed happy. He seemed comfortable. It was a pleasant morning. At noon, I brought a small wrapped envelope to my daughter. I told her it was her real Christmas gift. She opened it at the kitchen table while her husband poured himself more coffee. She pulled out a single folded letter and read it, and I watched her face change. The letter was from Patricia's office. It was addressed to both of them. It outlined, simply and in plain English, the residency rights that had been dormant in the original construction agreement, the ones Patricia had found and formalized. It confirmed that I held a documented, legally recognized life estate right to the in-law suite for as long as I chose to remain, that this right transferred with the property in any future sale, and that any changes to that arrangement would require my written agreement and fair compensation determined by an independent appraiser. It also outlined what I had retained from my old home sale, a small amount I had not contributed to the construction, held in my own account, that Patricia had helped me structure as a separate reserve. Not a large number, but mine. Document, separate. My son-in-law set down his coffee cup. He said, "What is this?" I said, "It's documentation of my rights as a resident of this property. You should have your own attorney review it, of course. I'd encourage that." He looked at my daughter. She was still looking at the letter. He said, "We should have talked about this." I said, "I agree. I tried to." There was a silence. Not a comfortable one. But I had been sitting in uncomfortable silences in that house for 14 months, and I had learned that they pass. My daughter looked up at me. Her face was complicated in the way that faces are when more than one thing is happening inside them at once. She said, "Mom," I said, "I love you. I want this to work. I've always wanted this to work. I meant that. But I need you to understand that I am not a guest in my own life. And I need you to know that I know things, and I understand things, and I have been paying attention." She put the letter down. She said, "I didn't know you were unhappy." I said, "I wasn't unhappy. I was careful. We had Christmas dinner together, the three of us, which might surprise you." It surprised me a little too. But I had made a pie that morning. My mother's recipe, brown sugar sweet potato, the one I've made every Christmas since I was 34. And my daughter asked if we were still eating together, and I said yes, of course. Because that's the difference between having rights and using them as weapons. I wasn't there to burn anything down. I just needed the foundation to be real. My son-in-law was quiet through most of dinner. My daughter asked me questions about Wanda, about the drive, about a book I'd mentioned reading. It was the most she'd talked directly to me in months. I noticed that. After dinner, I washed the dishes and she dried them, the way we used to when she was in high school, and we'd talk about nothing, about everything, about whatever was on her mind. She didn't say much that night, but she stood there beside me and she dried every dish, and at the end she said, "I'm glad you stayed, Mom." I handed her the last bowl. I said, "So am I. It's February now. The paperwork is filed. Patricia sent me the final confirmation last week. Wanda has her copy. I have mine in the drawer beneath my notebook, behind the watercolor postcard my husband sent me from a conference in Boston in 1997 that says only, 'Thinking of you. Home Thursday. Save me the good coffee. I still walk with Phyllis on Thursday mornings.'" Last week we talked about a novel she'd assigned to seniors for 30 years, the one where the woman at the center realizes late that she has been living someone else's idea of her life. Phyllis said she always asked her students the same question about it. Not what did she do wrong, but what did she finally understand? I thought about that walking home. I understood that I had spent a long time being grateful in a way that made me small. Grateful to be included. Grateful to be wanted. Grateful enough to stop asking questions I should have asked. I had confused gratitude with powerlessness and called it love. I don't think my daughter loves me any less than I thought she did. I think she loves me the way people sometimes love things they've stopped paying careful attention to, the way you love a view you see every morning, until one day you really look at it again and think, "Oh, that's still beautiful." I was waiting to be looked at again. The mountains are still visible this morning. The coffee is good. My notebook is on the table and I'm about to write in it, the way I have almost every morning for 40 years. I didn't need to burn anything down. I just needed them to know that I could read the room, that I had always been reading it, that the woman standing quietly in the kitchen was never as still as she seemed. I set down my cup. Outside, a neighbor's dog is barking at something, only it can see. The sun is on the window. It's a good morning. Some things you don't announce. You just make sure they're written down. I've thought about that kitchen moment more times than I can count. The pot roast on the stove, the fogged window, the dish in my hand that I set down so carefully, like if I moved too fast, something would shatter that I couldn't put back together. And me, standing there listening to my own life being discussed like a line item on a budget. What I've come to understand is that the moment didn't create what came after. Everything that came after was already in me. It just needed that moment to become clear. I had spent years being the kind of woman who made herself easy to overlook, Not because I was weak. I want to say that plainly. I was a librarian for 31 years. I raised a daughter. I cared for a dying husband with more grace than I knew I had. None of that is weakness. But somewhere along the way, I confused being generous with being invisible, and those are not the same thing at all. Generosity is a choice you make from a place of fullness. Invisibility is what happens when you stop believing your presence requires any explanation. What I did after that night. The notebook, the attorney, the separate bank account, the quiet months of paying attention. None of it came from anger. That surprises people when I tell them. They expect the story to be about revenge, and it isn't. It's about something quieter than that. It's about deciding that what you know matters, and that how you protect yourself is a reflection of how much you respect the life you've been given. Phyllis asked me once on one of our Thursday walks whether I felt guilty. I had to think about it honestly. The answer was no, but not because I'm someone without a conscience. The opposite, actually. I acted the way I did because I believe that integrity isn't only about how you treat other people. It's also about whether you're honest enough to protect what's real, to document what's true, to refuse to let the story of your own life be written by someone else. And then there's the part that took the most out of me. Staying, not leaving in anger, not cutting off my daughter, who is also that 7-year-old in the yellow swimsuit squinting into the sun, choosing to sit down to Christmas dinner and pass the sweet potato pie and dry the dishes afterward. That took more out of me than signing any legal document, because it required me to hold two things at once, my own dignity and my love for her. That tension doesn't resolve neatly. I'm not sure it's supposed to. What I know is this: the women in my life who have come through hard things, Wanda, Phyllis, my mother before them, they all shared something I used to mistake for stubbornness. Now I understand it better. It's the refusal to stop thinking clearly just because the situation is painful. It's keeping the notebook. It's making the appointment. It's asking the questions you're afraid of the answers to, because not knowing is its own kind of surrender. I didn't need to burn anything down. I just needed to stop pretending the smoke wasn't there. Some things you don't announce. You just make sure they're written down.